offline again. Yeah. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Rise of Local Energy Systems. We've still got a few minutes till we start, so I'm just joining now to say welcome to the webinar. Thank you for your time, and we hope you get some new perspectives and learnings from the webinar today. We'll go offline again now and come back on a little nearer the time. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Rise of Local Energy Systems. My name's John Slow. Thanks for joining. We've got 5 minutes until we get started. So I'll go offline again in a minute and we'll give people a few more minutes to join before we get going on the hour. If you've got any questions or technical problems, then you can use the questions or chat feature on the control panel and send a message to us and we'll get back to you using the same mechanism. So we'll be back again in a few minutes and we'll get going on the hour. Speak to you then. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Rise of Local Energy Systems. My name's John Slow. I'm the director here at Delta and joined by a couple of colleagues who I'll introduce shortly to share some of our views, perspective and research on local energy systems. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. We can still see a number of people joining, so we'll give everyone a chance to get online and view the slides and hear the sound. In the event of any questions or technical problems, you can use the questions and the chat feature on the right hand on your control panel and direct them to us, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We will be recording today's webinar, and you can also get a copy of the slides if you drop us an email. So no need to make frantic notes as we talk or take screenshots of the screen. You can get all the slides and hear the recording afterwards. We can still see more people joining, so we'll give people another couple of minutes to get online, and then we'll get going. Today's webinar will be 40 to 45 minutes in length, and we've got a couple of polls where you can vote for certain things to make it interactive. Everyone on the line is muted. We find this is best to keep down background noise, but you can, as I said, interact with us via the questions and the chat feature on the webinar control panel. Right, it's 3 o'clock now, 4 o'clock in Western Europe. We'll give people 1 or 2 minutes more to join as we can see the numbers ticking up still, and then we'll get going. We've had a good deal of interest in the topic, so reflecting what we see and hear across the industry, that local energy systems are rising up people's agenda. So a timely moment to have a webinar and share some of our thoughts and perspectives. So it's 1 minute past the hour now. To keep to time, I think we'll make a start. So hello everyone, my name's John Slow. I'm hosting today's webinar, but my colleagues Jeremy Harrison and Rita Desmatter will be doing the bulk of the talking. Today we'll be talking for about 30 minutes or so about local energy systems and then we'll have some questions. We may take questions as we go, depending on what comes in. So a few housekeeping rules and then we'll get started. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we'll make the recording available afterwards. The slides will also be available if you'd like to drop us an email and we'll send those through to you. There's a couple of polls during the webinar today where you can vote on 2 questions that we ask you, and you can use the questions in the chat feature on the right-hand side to interact with us. We'll try and answer questions during the webinar. Anything we don't get to, then we'll get back to you afterwards. So moving on to the next slide, and this is where you can test whether your software is working. You should see a pictures of the 3 people on today's webinar. So myself, John Slow, and Jeremy. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi, John. Hello, everybody.
And Rita.
Hello, everybody.
So that's our local energy system team. Moving on to the next slide, very briefly, for those of you that don't know Delta, we're specialists in the energy transition. So on the shift from old energy to new energy, carrying out research on how the market is developing across the sorts of topics that you can see on your screen here. And we work in a couple of ways, and we've got a diverse range of clients across Europe, Japan, and beyond. If you want to know more about Delta, then please visit our website or drop us an email. Now, on to today's topic. Why local energy systems? Well, as I'm sure you all know, energy assets are becoming increasingly distributed and often behind the meter. So batteries, electric vehicles, electric heating, etc. And the energy system has been optimized at national level, but we see that it will be optimized increasingly at local level. Now that might mean household, building, it might mean community, it might mean city, town, it might mean a DSO area. Point being that optimization will not only be national, carried out at national levels, more and more locally. Optimization will happen for the whole value chain as well. So for the benefits of networks, for benefits of those with wholesale market positions, for the benefit of the system operator, balancing the system on a second-by-second and minute-by-minute basis. And lastly, we think this will deliver greater local benefits. So if you optimize it locally, then some of that value will reside locally, perhaps with a community, for example. So on the back of this, we've developed a new research service, and it's from this that we're sharing some of our views and perspectives today. Okay, agenda. On to my colleague, Jeremy.
Okay, thanks very much, John. So today, against that background, we have a few questions that we plan to be answering. Not in a great deal of detail, unfortunately, due to the time, but the key points we'll be addressing are, firstly, perhaps the most important thing is, what is a local energy system? Why the sudden interest? What is it that's happening now, which is making it such a key concept? And another question that's asked quite often is, when will they become economic? How will they overcome the economic challenges? So not just when, but how they will become economic. What are the opportunities for the different players, different market participants, and also what are some of the challenges? And then the question which we get asked most often is, how do I make money from local energy systems? So these are the points we're going to cover. And then following that, as John says, after about 30 minutes, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. But again, if you have questions as we go through this, please feel free to note them down, and we'll see if we can fit them in as we go, or alternatively answer those at the end. So we thought we'd start off with an icebreaker to ask you what you think are the most important benefits of local energy systems. So Rita, would you like to just introduce that?
So, as you were saying, thank you. Here is the poll with 5 questions. So we would like you to choose one of the 5 options about your opinion on what is the most important benefit of less. So it looks like supporting the decarbonization of the wider energy system is the most important for you, with overcoming green constraint.
If we give you a couple more seconds to vote, your votes are anonymous. Well, actually, they're not completely anonymous. We can see them, but no one else can see them on the webinar. So don't worry about sharing your thoughts with others on the webinar, although you are sharing them with us. We can see nearly 80% of people have voted. So I think if we close the poll now, Rita, let's see what the final views are.
I don't know if you can see the results.
Yes, we can, and we can see decarbonisation is the most popular, following grid constraints and a bit on resilience.
Yeah, that's an interesting outcome. I think it illustrates probably the fact that the majority of our audience are based in Europe. I saw a similar poll to this a couple of weeks ago, where the system resilience was by far the most important feature, and that is common throughout North America and the Far East, where the grid is a lot less resilient than it is in Western Europe. And so we can see that the resilience figure here, we've got 11% of people thought that was the most important feature. But for us, the decarbonisation of the wider energy system, which rated almost 60% of votes, is by far and away the most significant feature. So I think that's quite interesting to illustrate the difference between the drivers in different markets globally. So thanks very much for that poll, Rita. Interesting outcome. So the question we then need to come on to is, I think, what are local energy systems? Much discussed, and to some people, it is simply a small energy system, but the key feature of it is that it balances largely the production of energy and the consumption of energy within a bounded area. And that can be generation from renewables, but it can also be from low carbon technologies like combined heat and power, but also from even fossil fuel generators such as diesel generators, if they provide a component to support the overall energy system, even though in themselves they may not be low carbon. And there are specific challenges, and both economic and technical challenges, which I think the poll has just illustrated, that there are different drivers in different areas. And generally speaking, it's fair to say that a local energy system is simply a microcosm of the conventional energy system, just a smaller version of it. However, that was the view we had when we started off, and generally speaking, that aligns with the concept of a microgrid. But what we have found during our discussions with various stakeholders is that the concept is more widely used to address community energy, local energy communities, local energy systems in a much broader context. So we've developed a local energy system typology with two axes. So the x-axis you can see here, on the left-hand side, generally speaking, there's a strong imbalance between supply and demand, and it can simply be about facilitating the connection of renewable generation. On the far right-hand side, exactly the opposite case, where there is a perfect balance between supply and demand, in some cases with off-grid microgrids, which, although technically they're not actually microgrids, but islanded systems which are completely in balance, supply and demand. And then along that axis, varying degrees of balance between supply and demand. But we found that that alone wasn't enough to define the concept of a local energy system. And we've decided that actually the y-axis, equally important, is actually the role of the ownership and the business models. So at the top of the axis, systems which are operated by the incumbents or monopolies or private organizations, businesses, and at the bottom end, community or public sector, or even individuals involved in the operation. Now, I'm not going to go through all these now. That will be part of our subscription service, which you're very welcome to ask about later on. But this is just to illustrate some of the different typologies that we've been looking at. There are three specific examples here, which we're going to talk about in a bit more detail now. Those are the ones bounded in red. So on the far left, an example of simply integrating renewables into the system. Then the next one with a more sophisticated integration of renewable generation to a community. And on the far right side, the Simris, the E.ON project, which is a fully functioning 100% renewable electrical microgrid. So Rita's now going to go through some of these case studies to illustrate the key characteristics of them.
Jeremy, we've just got one question. See if I can quickly confirm something with you. Question, do we see microgrids, every microgrid is a local energy system, but not every local energy system is a microgrid? So microgrids being a subset of local energy systems. Is that correct?
Yes, very astutely put. Exactly.
Okay.
And that's the technical axis. So as you say, so microgrids at the far right-hand side are part of the local energy systems. They're a very specific example, but certainly not all local energy systems are microgrids.
Thank you. So the first local energy system I'm going to talk about is Harlaw Hydro, which is a local energy community. It's based in Scotland, near Edinburgh. And here the community installed a micro hydro power plant on a reservoir of 95 kilowatts and is directly connected on the distribution. So it's not a microgrid. The purpose of Harlaw was to exploit local resources by reviving sites that already had previously in the 19th and early 20th century a micro hydro. In terms of ownership, it's entirely owned by the community who set a cooperative, and the business model is based on subsidy with feed-in tariff. So what's interesting about Harlaw? It's a perfect example of local energy community project where they were opportunistic because they chose this site, which was then easier to have all of the agreement of local authorities. On the downside, it may not be sustainable in the long term because it's run by the member of Harlaw Hydro who are highly skilled, but we don't know if tomorrow they will still be able to do it. And it's also based on feed-in tariff, which will last not more than 20 years. So that's an example of a local energy community. Now, going back to the matrix, I will speak about Issy Grid, which is the first smart grid on district level in France. It's located in the city of Issy-les-Moulineaux in the south of Paris. And the point here was to optimize energy consumption and generation at the district level. So they installed 300 square meters of solar panel and second life EV batteries to optimize the system and manage the peak. So this is a good example of lowering capex by utilizing second life EV batteries because it was cheaper than batteries. The project was initiated by Bouygues Immobilier, and they form a consortium with around 10 stakeholders, with Bouygues Energy, Bouygues Telecom, Total, Schneider, Microsoft, EDF, Enedis, so Prestaria. And the system that is set is quite interesting because there are 14 information systems throughout the district, which reads in real time the consumption and the generation and optimizes as well in real time. What's interesting about it is the innovation side of it, and the software that was created was a community energy management software and being built by Alstom and Bouygues, and they created the startup Mbix. So in terms of replicability, it has been used in other cities and districts. Maybe a downside of it, or something that could be improved, is the participation of the community, where today the consumer can read in real time its consumption, but in terms of investment, there's no possible participation. And now moving on to the system technically more complete, so a real microgrid. You can see on the right-hand side the example of Simris. So Simris was built by E.ON, which is in Sweden, the DSO and the utility as well. So the purpose of Simris was to build and demonstrate the technical capability of building a microgrid run by 100% renewable energy. So we have a wind turbine, solar PV, a backup generator that is run on biodiesel, Li-ion batteries to serve as grid forming, and the redox flow battery as storage. In terms of ownership, it's quite interesting because the wind turbine and the solar farm are owned by the inhabitant of Simris, and the distribution network and the rest of the microgrid is owned by E.ON. So in terms of business model, there's nothing that changes for the inhabitants. They receive their bill the same way as any other customer in the rest of the countries receive. And for the wind turbine and the solar farm, they have a steering agreement to operate the assets. So what's interesting about Simris is that is still today test bed for E.ON, and they keep on innovating and using technical aspects that they will reuse it in some other site, off-grid site in Hungary or Germany. Jeremy, I go back to you.
Okay, thank you for those examples, Rita. I think it's quite interesting just to see some examples of the wide variety of systems that are out there. And I think that one of the things we're seeing is, apart from the huge variety, is the ways that the local energy systems are evolving and maturing. So that some time ago, the idea of a local energy system was very often a solution to a niche problem. And the example we show here of the island of Egg, which was an island off the west coast of Scotland, where the inhabitants were dependent on individual diesel generators, which they would run for maybe an hour or so a day, very expensive, poor reliability, and not really an ideal long-term solution. And they got together and developed a community-owned energy company, which owns a small amount of wind turbines, a small micro-hydro scheme, a very small amount of PV, which operates in the summer to support the lower rainflow there, and batteries and a backup diesel generator. That's the sort of system which you see all over the world in terms of island communities, but it's not a mass market proposition. It's something which is very much focused on the specific needs of individual communities. We then saw a growth of subsidy-driven community-based schemes. So the example that Rita mentioned before, the Harlaw system, which is entirely dependent on the income from feed-in tariff. And again, those kind of projects in many European countries still operating subsidized and only economically viable because of the existence of feed-in tariffs or some other form of support mechanisms. And what we're now seeing is an evolution from those niches and subsidy-driven markets into value-driven systems. And one of the key drivers behind the E.ON project, for example, is to resolve the issues around community engagement, managing intermittent renewables, and decarbonisation of the energy system. So it's looking much more at longer-term sustainable values. So the question really is, we've all identified the growing interest in local energy systems, but the question is why it's happened so much recently. And it's not just about the resilience issues, although that's clearly one particular issue in some markets. What we've found is that there are two sets of drivers: negative drivers in terms of the challenges to the existing energy system, so issues around the possibility of grid defection, about communities deciding to go either not necessarily off grid fully, but certainly taking over part of the system, the lack of trust in energy suppliers and the very poor margins in commodity energy supply, the reduction in support mechanisms, and interestingly, the complexity in the wider energy system. And that has caused huge challenges in terms of the requirements to invest in the longer term low carbon 2050 energy system. On the positive side, what's making them attractive? The technologies involved are becoming more mature. PV, storage, and so on are becoming lower cost, and their performance is increasing. The newer generations of wind turbines, for example, are significantly more effective, much higher load factors, and able to support a balanced renewable system much better. Then there are other things like innovative trading platforms and people wanting to embrace innovative funding opportunities, particularly with the very low interest rates which are available for conventional investments. And of course, the idea of everything as a service, so heat as a service, for example. So the question then is, when will it become cost competitive with conventional supply? And the simple answer is that in some applications it already is. So if you look, for example, at the expected costs of electricity delivered to households, the dotted line there shows the UK projected costs over the next 20 years or so. So that's the dotted line you can see. And then there are two other lines. The upper line is the LCOE for electricity generated from a specific example of a microgrid we looked at, which you can see today is slightly more expensive in terms of the delivered energy cost. But the lower line, the paler blue one, is the cost of electricity supply if you factor in the value of the flexibility services that system can provide. So that would be the LCOE based on a typical 10% cost of capital. And what you can see is that if you reduce the cost of capital, for example, by engaging with the public and leveraging other forms of finance, then already today, the competitive cost of the microgrid is lower than it is for the existing system. And that's primarily because the most significant component of the LCOE in the renewable energy system is the upfront investment, the capex in the renewable resources, and the cost of funding that. So if you can reduce either the cost of capital or the cost of the investment, then you have a much more competitive system. And what this shows is that, as I say, this is for a specific example of a microgrid. It is already possible today to deliver a lower cost of supply to individuals if the cost of capital is low enough.
Jeremy, we've got one question which I'd like to bring in now, or two related questions actually, about the cost of electricity, for example, from the Simris scheme. So to what degree, I guess two aspects to this, to what degree is the cost different for people in Simris today? And if it's not because they're paying their bill in the normal way, would it be cheaper, or is it more expensive, and is the cost socialized across other users in Sweden? So maybe general questions specific to Simris, so you could answer them specifically or generally.
Well, I think the fact is that the Simris example, as Rita mentioned earlier, is operated exactly the same as a conventional system. There is no difference in supply cost, and that's because it's acting as a technical pilot scheme. However, the question really is whether it could be operating more cost effectively. And in fact, the two graphs we show there are based on a standardized version of something quite similar to the Simris scheme. So we took an example of a scheme about 1,000 homes with a wind turbine and with storage and so on. And we looked at the levelized cost of supply for that installation. So yes, it could be cheaper, and that's really what that graph on the right-hand side is showing. It's saying that if the local community invested their money and wanted a 3% return rather than a more commercial rate of, say, 10, then they could already have an energy supply which would be a lower cost. So it is possible, certainly.
Jeremy, this was just looking at electricity, I think, the modelling we did here. And we've got a question, how would that change if you looked at heat? And I know it's not a simple answer, but would that increase the value and cost effectiveness? Might it decrease it? As you start to integrate other energy vectors, does it help to create more value and reduce the cost further?
It does to some extent, in that you're delivering heat and power, and therefore the the pot is bigger. However, it depends where the heat is coming from. So if you have a cogeneration system based on renewable sources where you have a low or zero cost for the fuel, then yes, it will add value. The problem occurs if you have, for example, a gas engine CHP scheme where you're still dependent on the cost of the gas. So yes, there are potential values, particularly in terms of the flexibility you can get from having a dispatchable generator, but it becomes a lot more complex to actually identify the specifics of that. So you'll be then looking at, again on this graph, the two lines there, the dark blue, which is just supplying energy, and then the lower line where you're also trading flexibility services, which reduces, well, it adds value into the pot, which means you can reduce the cost of supply effectively.
Okay, so it could.
Yes, in a word, yeah.
Jeremy, on the next slide, we've got lots of different, or three main drivers of value: reducing cost, increasing the value created, and the value creation to affect the withdrawal of subsidies. Which of these would you highlight as being most important?
Okay, I think the simple one to, I wouldn't say to rule out, but the one which is inevitably happening anyway, that the capex of these schemes is reducing. The technology is maturing. You have the learning curve for all renewable technologies, so that's reflected in the gradient of the lines we saw on the previous graph. So that's going to happen anyway. It's not dramatic, but it's happening. It continues to happen even from the fairly low base of PV and other costs today. The other two areas which are a bit more challenging, the value of the production of energy is quite dependent on the value of services like flexibility. And although that's quite a significant value in itself, it's less definite than the costs. So I'd say that the one key characteristic which will make these more competitive is actually to reduce the cost of the funding. And therefore, it really does make sense to have the public sector involved, whether it's through communities, municipalities that is, which are able to obtain funding of say 4 to 6%, or whether it's individuals who might be prepared to accept a lot less than that, maybe in the 2 to 3%. So
okay, or it's infrastructure investment. So we're looking at infrastructure type returns that would help to reduce that cost of capital.
Yes, I mean, yes, what it means is that individuals can safely invest in their own energy system where they are the source of the income. And as you say, against a very low risk infrastructure investment.
In terms of the capital, so we've talked about capital, which is the first point on this slide. The next point, well, and we'll come back to business models, but I want to bring up the next point here of value. So cannibalization of value. I guess the really critical thing is that we're not talking about moving value around from one part of the system to another, but the creation of new value.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the challenges around going right back to the beginning, the typologies, where people talk about community energy. To some people, that's almost a political construct, where we're looking much more at taking the value from one level of the market and redistributing it elsewhere. I think, to me, that the true value of a local energy system is actually in the creation of value by exploiting local resources, by matching those with local demand, and by engaging with the local community to leverage their low-cost investment, but also to involve them in participating in the ownership of the scheme. So it is about creation, not about cannibalization, or it should be.
And that in the last box at the bottom here, we can see the ways in which that value might be created as examples.
Yeah, some of those are the hard values, others are softer. So again, things like resilience, trying to put a value on that in some cases is quite difficult. In some cases, like data centers, there is a very concrete value, but in terms of individual homes, then it's much more difficult to put a value on.
But what we have talked with DSOs about already, I guess, is the fact that as transport becomes electrified, potentially heat becomes more electrified, that resilience becomes even more important for communities.
Absolutely, yes.
And the point in the top box around business models, I guess it's easy to talk about this, but unless you can find business models that deliver a return for those putting money in, a workable business to get all the bits of the jigsaw working together, then this will be just theory rather than anything that can be put to practice.
Indeed, and that's why we have been looking at business models. And the next slide actually shows one example, a very simplified example of a local energy system showing the roles of a local energy system operator within the existing system. So I'm not going to go through in detail. You're welcome to ask questions about it later. But fundamentally, this is illustrating how a local energy system company could operate without cannibalizing value. So in other words, for a new, let's say, new village, new housing development, where the microgrid local energy system will be constructed by or under the control of the LESCO and operated by them on behalf of the community. As I said, I don't go into a lot of detail, but it's just a single example in which we illustrate that you don't need to cannibalize, you can actually create value from the new system. So, clearly there's a lot more questions we still could ask and answer, but just to summarize, given the limited time, how do I make money from local energy systems? First thing is you need to define what you mean by a local energy system. It's impossible to replicate a successful project unless you know how it will align with what your particular circumstances are. And then when and how they become viable. In some cases, we've shown that they already can be. And you can enhance profitability by doing a number of things, by reducing the capex, reducing the cost of capital, or increasing the value you generate. But there are obstacles. And I think it's one of the key things that people are going to find is finding fair ways of both avoiding the cannibalization of value, which passes increased socialized costs to the people who aren't part of the system, but which also reward the investments made by the participants. So I think that's going to be one of the key areas to explore in the future.
Thanks, Jeremy. So those of you that know Delta, our mission is to help the energy sector and society in general to get to a low carbon future as quickly and as effectively as possible. And one of the ways we do that is through our research services. So this is our new local energy system service, which is aimed to support people who are involved in engaging with or developing or responding to the rise of local energy systems. So this is the one commercial part of the webinar where I unashamedly say if you'd like to learn more about the service or are interested in it, then please do contact us. Now, we've got another poll coming up. So you can see here what we have developed under the service on the left-hand side. And what we're interested in is what your priorities are. So what your key questions are. And there may be other ones not listed here. But we're going to launch another poll here where we can see which topics you're most interested in. This is helpful to us. It's also hopefully helpful to you that you can see where your peers are interested and what your peers see as the key issue. So if you vote for one of the options, again, your votes cannot be seen by anyone else on the webinar, although if we really wanted to, we could look at how you voted. Not that we will. We'll give you maybe 10 more seconds to vote. We can see the percentage ticking up. 2/3 of you have voted. More than 70% of you have voted. Last few seconds, over 80%. And if we publish the results now, you can see what's you're most interested in. So quite a mix of different issues actually. Business models, role of the DSO I think is a really big point. For some they see it as a bit of a threat, others see it as opportunities, and interest in the other three topics as well. So thanks for that, and we'll put this poll in the slide set that we send out if you'd like to receive the slides. So moving on now to, I think, some questions. So we've had quite a few questions come in. We've answered a few, we've got a lot more. So let's pick off one here. So Yeah, future revenue. So, Jeremy and Rita, are there opportunities to use local energy systems maybe for a new development or new generation where there isn't sufficient grid connection available? So it could be, I guess, a generation source wanting to connect, or a new build development where there might not be the grid connection or a high reinforcement cost. So could that be an application of a local energy system?
Absolutely. That's one of the key applications. If you think about the left-hand side of that matrix, a lot of projects are implemented purely to facilitate connection either of renewable generation, so the GEAR project, which is about facilitating the connection of additional wind turbines to a very weak feeder. That is entirely to do with facilitating renewable integration with the existing infrastructure using a battery rather than a reinforced cable. But it also works the other way around, where, for example, a housing developer would want to build a new development, but there isn't sufficient capacity locally in the near future, and therefore they're constrained from that development. Having said that, the idea that you would necessarily want to have a smaller than usual connection in the long term isn't necessarily the case, because one of the key values that you obtain from a local energy system, even if it is able to be islanded and operated independently of the main grid, is its ability to provide services and therefore to capture value from the distribution network and ultimately from the overall energy system. So yes, you can use it to reduce your cost of connection, but generally speaking, the systems we've looked at, you gain more from the value of trading services across the connection than you would gain from the savings in not having the connection. So a fully islanded system is very suboptimal, for example.
Okay, so always good to have a good connection there, and to maybe work in both directions, yes, depending on exactly who needs what. One other question here about fuel poverty, and are local energy systems just for the well-off, or could they be for everyone? I guess if they're fundamentally provide a low-cost system, then everyone in society could benefit from them.
Absolutely. This is definitely not a rich man's toy. To me, the idea of a local energy system is it enables local people to engage with the energy system, to gain lower cost energy, but also to be an active participant in it rather than simply being a passive customer. So yes, it's definitely not just for the richer people. In fact, quite the opposite.
And I guess coming back to your 2x2, Jeremy, there's the private sector ownership at the top of that, and the community ownership towards the bottom, and there are different points on that. That's not an either or, there are different points on the spectrum between the two.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other things that we do need to be careful about, though, is I mentioned one of the challenges about socialization of costs, that there is a danger if you, for example, if we consider a new build housing development, there's nothing there at the moment, so you're not cannibalizing any value. You're simply deciding who controls which part of it, what services are provided by different parties. If you look at existing systems, and this is one of the dangers I see with some of the proposals for community energy involvement, is that it is very much about just transferring of ownership, transferring of assets. And whilst that might benefit some of the people within the system, the people who don't participate, for whatever reason, are left out in the cold. And if you cannibalize a part of the network, it could well be that the incumbent network operator, DSO, ends up with only the bits that nobody else wants. And so the socialized cost of supporting that affects the poor people more than they have been in the past. It's the same sort of thing as feed-in tariffs. It's fine as long as everybody's getting the benefit, but if you have just a few people benefiting it, and then the other people end up paying the bill.
So coming back to that point of transfer, not transferring value, but creating value.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions we haven't had time to respond to, so we'll get back to you on those individually. If you would like a copy of the slides or the link to the recording, then please drop Jeremy or Rita an email and we'll get back to you. And we always really enjoy talking about these questions and topics with our network. So if you would like to discuss any issue, whether you're interested in subscribing to our research or not, then we'd love to talk with you, exchange our ideas, hear your thoughts, and continue the discussion. It's a big topic, one that we think is only going to get bigger, and one that will be a key part of the transition from old to new energy. So thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita.
Thank you.
And thank you to all for joining, and wishing you a good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye.